double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Ah, there you are, my heart is. I've got a question for you. What comes to mind when I mention the word witches? Are they good? Are they evil? The reason I'm interested in this topic is because of a visit to England late last year. It was to the north of England to explore where I grew up, and particularly the area around Pendle Hill in Lancashire. It was late October and Halloween, and witches are big because there were 10 local witches hanged for witchcraft and murder in 1612. 6 out of these 10 came from 2 families. So when I got back, I was curious. So all of you, come with me on a journey now back to Pendle Hill. It's known in the area for its shape. It can be seen for miles around. And it was bare now, but back then it was forested. And I'll concentrating on 3 main characters who are Demdike, her granddaughter Alison, and Chattox. And it was the verdict was a result of Alison's confession. So let me tell you Alison's story. She was wandering in the forest with her grandmother, and her grandmother talked to him to letting a familiar spirit suck her blood, and she would have the power to do anything. Later, Alison saw in the form of a black dog, and let this happen. In March 1612, Alison was walking in the forest alone, and she met a peddler, John Moore, who refused to sell her some pins. So she cursed him, and moments later, he collapsed with a seizure. Alison voluntarily confessed to bewitching him, and she also went on to talk about her grandmother, whom she said had been asked by a neighbour if she could help with a sick cow. This she did late one night. Next morning, the cow was dead. Then she talked about Demdox, who used to be a friend of Demdike, her grandmother, but they fell out and the families feuded. Alison said that Demdike bewitched her family. She said the Chattox family burgled their family home. Her father feared Chattox and said that she bewitched him to death. On his deathbed, 11 years later, he talked about the fact that he had to pay, that he had a covenant and had to pay a yearly meal. And he hadn't paid last year, and that's why he was bewitched to death. It was the confession that did them in. Now, let me talk about the role of history and literature. Witches, who were they? Well, they were usually women, elderly, poor, begged for a living, and often went hungry. They had great knowledge of plants, which could heal and which could kill, and others were folk healers, and they blamed illnesses on magic, and they offered counter spells to cure their patients. And that they also offered to divine the name of the cursing witch for a further fee, of course. Witches were also scapegoats. Times of trouble, blame rears its head. They were blamed for the Great Plague. They were blamed for unexplained illnesses, crop failures. In times of political upheaval and instability, we saw the rise in the witch crazes, particularly during 1550 and 1650. And for example, the great European witch hunts, known as the burnings. In England, they were hanged. So, if we look at this time was the time of James I, and he feared rebellion because of the plot to blow up Parliament by Guy Fawkes in 1605. So it was a time of suspicion and persecution. Interestingly, it wasn't until the 1970s that historians based their data on facts. Before that, the courts actually kept details, trial records, which were long and detailed. So writers chose an easier path, which was unsubstantiated literature, such as witch hunting manuals, propaganda, sermons against witches, and lurid pamphlets detailing the most sensational crimes. What now, I ask you, when modern times? Well, I'll tell you. Tourism, money, survival, especially in the Pendle Hill area. You can go on witch trails, ghost hunts, there are museums, shops, and the shops are decorated and have witches inside it on Halloween, and souvenirs. Every Halloween there is a gathering to perpetuate the memory of the witches on the hill. Pendle, of course. So, looking at all this, some things never change. Human behaviour, for instance. In times of trouble, as I said, blame rears its head. Human behaviour, the traits such as betrayal, blame, competitiveness, cunning, corruption, laziness, media sensationalism, and revenge. And if we look at language, we perpetuated in our language witch hunts, the frantic persecution of perceived enemies. And a good example of this is the 1930s McCarthy era when the suspected communists. And also, literature, Harry Potter novels, set at Hogwarts, School of Witches and Wizardry. And also, every Halloween, the knock on the door, trick or treat, a veiled threat. Who has the power? So I ask you this question. Do witches deserve their reputation for bad or evil? And if you don't say no, I'll cast a spell on you.